So hello, my name's Andrew Jarman, and I'm a long-standing BWARS member, primarily interested in ants. So I've noticed over the years that many BWARS members regard ant identification with great trepidation. They regard it as a complete mystery and don't know how to start about it. And it's not surprising, really. Many BWARS members come to BWARS initially with an interest in social wasps or bumblebees, and in comparison, ants are very hard to identify. They are small, quite uniform in appearance, and the characters need to tell them apart are very small and difficult to discern if you're not used to them without some experience. And this is true identification in the field as well as using keys. So in the field, you at least need quite a high power lens in order to see some of the characteristics. And even then, you can't see many of the characteristics. With the keys, you generally have to have a stereo microscope for some of the characteristics. So this is all rather intimidating. And the question is, how can you gain that initial experience that gives you the confidence to move forward with ant identification? And that's the aim of this talk. So it's aimed more at the beginner level. So apologies to those who know more about ants. It's aimed at that initial recognition of the most common species that you're likely to come across in the field, as well as an introduction to some of the more baffling characters that you come across in the keys that you have to use in the end. You can't get past them. So before we go on, many of you, if you've used keys to identify ants, will be very familiar with this book, Skinner and Allen Ants, that has really good keys for British ants, but it's now, as many of you will know, very dated. It's 1996 was the first edition. More recent keys are available, but they tend to include European species as well. So they're very hard. They're even harder to use than those just for the British species. And the good news is that there's a second edition in the works, and I've been very privileged to join Gary to contribute the keys to this new edition. This is in the works, and hopefully it will be published, I think, hopefully next year. The second thing to point out at the beginning is that, of course, we are going to be concentrating here on workers. So ants are eusocial. You have not only the non-reproductive female workers, you have the reproductive queens or gynes, which rather different characteristics, and then the males present even more different characteristics again. This is actually a queen pupa here that this ant's dragging along. This other ant is dragging along a male pupa, which is a bit larger than a worker pupa. By the way, I will say right now, I think the videos, they look very nice on my screen here, but I think they may lose something in the compression for the recording. So apologies for that if it's a lot more jerky than I'm seeing on my screen. So this is just to say that we are just going to be concentrating on worker ants, but I'm well aware that many of you, if you're searching for bees and wasps, will be coming across winged ants, maybe quite frequently. And those are useful because the male and queen keys provide complementary and different characteristics from the worker keys. And so sometimes if you have males and queens and workers together, you can get a better insight into what species you're looking at. Okay, so let's just now look at the scope of the problem in terms of British ant species. So we have about 54 species in 14 genera, and I've laid them out here. These are the genera. They belong to 4 subfamilies, and they all belong to one family, Formicidae. That's what all ants belong to. And keys will lay out the couplets in terms of identifying which subfamily you are looking at, and then which genus, and then which species within the genera. And that is difficult because even the first couplets in ant keys are quite difficult to tell the difference between ants of this subfamily compared with ants of this subfamily. And then telling apart the genera can be difficult as well. So that's tricky, but it can be simplified because many of these species and some of these subfamilies are actually very rare, or at least very inconspicuous compared with some of the common species. And so we can simplify things by just concentrating on the species that are beginner, someone coming to ants first of all, concentrating on the species they will encounter. And so this is my beginner's guide to the ants most commonly that you will encounter in the field. Things are much simpler. and relies on characters which are rather frowned upon taxonomically, because it relies on color and size, both of which are not very good for keys, because they are subjective and they're variable as to what they actually refer to, and they require experience. But for a bluffer's guide, then they are perfectly good. So you can see here we can distinguish most of the common species on size and color. So if it's a black or a dark brown ant, if it's small, it's going to be Lasius niger, most likely, the common black ant. If it's black but larger, then it's going to be either Formica fusca or Formica lamani, which are known as large black ants. And by the way, I'm including some English names here, even though ants mostly don't really have proper, well established English names, and some I've had to make up. But I know that Latin names make things quite inaccessible to some people, so I'm trying to include English names as well. If the ant is yellow, then it's very likely to be Lasius flavus, or the yellow hill ant. If it's red, then it's going to be one of the Myrmica red ants. There's quite a lot of species in that genus, but there's quite a number of common species: Ruginodis, Rubra, Scabrinotis, and Sabriletti are the common species. And then if it's bicolored and large, then it's most likely to be one of the Formica wood ants, of which we have 3 species in Britain. And if it's bicolored and small, then it will most likely be this ant, Leptothorax acervorum. And I've completely made up this name for this ant here, slender carpenter ant. It doesn't have an English name. And in fact, you can really argue that this is not a very good name for it. So this is not definitive, but 95% of the time, if you're a beginner looking at an ant in the field, you will probably be able to identify roughly what species and genus that ant is by using this sort of bluffer's guide. So maybe you'll make some mistakes along the way, but this will give you a start, and it will give you confidence. And this just shows you that this is not completely made up, that they do actually look rather like this. This will start to give you the confidence to start to put a name to an ant in the field, but also to give you a chance that going through the keys, you know roughly where you should probably be heading. So you can use the law of probabilities when going through the keys, rather than just treating every couplet as being a 50-50 chance which way it's going to go. Okay, so with that in mind, we can come back to our schema of ant species and genera, and we can recognize that actually that bluffer's guide only contained species from 4 different genera. And those genera come from just 2 subfamilies, the Myrmicinae and the Formicinae. So that already simplifies things greatly, because one of the most difficult parts at the very beginning of many ant keys is how to distinguish this subgenus, subfamily from this subfamily. And in fact, most of the time, it doesn't matter. It's going to be in this subfamily that your ant's going to be in. So that makes it much simpler. So now we can now concentrate on just distinguishing ants in these 2 subfamilies, and then go on to the genera within those subfamilies. And this is a much, much easier task, because these 2 subfamilies are really quite easy to tell apart, even in the field with a hand lens, or even with a photo. So this is a Myrmicine ant, a Myrmica, and this is a Formicine ant, in fact, a Formica. And in general, these look spiny and wrinkly. These don't have spines, and they tend to be smooth on the surface, don't have wrinkles. More formally, Myrmicine ants have 2 segments to their waist. So that's the bit in between the so-called mesosoma and the gaster. So these are the technical terms. They don't correspond exactly to the thorax and the abdomen. I'm not going to go into the details of why that is here. So if you call these thorax, if you call this a thorax, nobody's going to, I'm not going to mind anyway. I will probably call it a thorax in my talk by mistake sometimes anyway. But it's not, but strictly it's called a mesosoma. And the reason to have those words here in this talk is because you will come across those words within the keys. So it's as well to get to know them as soon as you can. So Myrmicine ants have a 2-segmented waist between the mesosoma and the gaster, and they also have spines on the end of the mesosoma. And they tend to be very wrinkly in their sculpture. Formicine ants, they have a 1-segmented waist, and they don't have spines on the rear of the mesosoma, and they tend to be not wrinkly at all, but rather smooth. So telling apart a Myrmicine ant from a Formicine ant is actually really quite straightforward, and you don't have to worry about the other subfamilies most of the time. So now, let's say the ant we're looking at has a one segmented waist. We know it's most likely a Formicine ant. So that narrows down straight away that ant to be either a Formica or a Lasius. And there's common species in both those genera, so it could be either Formica or Lasius. So how do we tell apart Formica from Lasius? A lot of the time, again, if we are a beginner with a bluffer's guide, we don't have to tell apart Formica from Lasius because we can just go on the other characteristics of the ant. So if it's a yellow ant, then, and if it's small, well, if it's yellow, it's going to be a Lasius. It's going to be most likely this ant, Lasius flavus. If it's large and bicolored, then it's going to be one of the Formica wood ants. So the only difficulty we really have where we do need to try and distinguish Lasius from Formica is if the ant is black. So if it's small, it's going to be most likely Lasius niger. If it's larger, it's going to be Formica fusca or Lamini. But small and large, that's a very difficult thing to assess if you're just beginning. And also they overlap quite a bit. So at this point, we will have to then look more closely at what distinguishes Lasius from Formica. But let's go through these other two cases first of all. This is Lasius flavus. So if it's a yellow ant, it's most likely to be Lasius flavus. This is known as the common yellow ant or the yellow hill ant, and it's the famous one that makes these very long-lasting mounds within old pastures. And it's very common. It's probably one of the most abundant ants across the whole of Britain, but it lives in large subterranean colonies, and so you don't normally see it above ground. It doesn't always just form mounds. It will also live quite happily in lawns and under stones, and like this nest here under the stone. So that's a very common ant that you will find if you lift over stones. There are other Lasius species which are yellow as well, but they're much rarer. They're also very hard to distinguish for someone without experience from Lasius flavus. So I'll just go through one of the characters in the keys that tends to get used to try and distinguish these other species. So quite often they will use the characters of hairs on the legs. So this is the tibia of one of the legs here, of these ants here. And the question is whether it has standing hairs or only pubescent. So in other words, this is from a species similar to Lasius flavus, where the tibia is covered with very, very tiny hairs, but they hardly really stand out from the edge of the tibia. Whereas this species has that pubescence, but it also has these large standing hairs as well. So quite easy to tell apart from that point of view, but you do have to be very careful. You need high power. With a hand lens, it's quite difficult. You can see it, but you also need very good lighting. You need to get the lighting just right. If you change the lighting, as you can see here, these are the same as these over here, then this becomes a lot more difficult to see these hairs. Okay, so moving on to the bicolored Formicine ants. So these are most likely going to be wood ants, and if you know anything about ants, you will probably know about wood ants. So they live in these large mounds in woods. They're very aggressive and dominant in the places they live in. And there are 3 species within on mainland UK. And from a bluffer's point of view, they're quite hard to tell apart. I'm not going to spend much time trying to tell you how to tell them apart. Geographically, they're quite distinctive. So if you are in the southern Britain or South Wales, then it's going to be most likely Formica rufa, the southern wood ant. If you go further north, that's where you get a problem because you get overlap between Formica rufa and Formica lugubris, the northern or hairy wood ant. So that's a bit more difficult. And then in Scotland, you have another species, Formica aquilonia, the Scottish wood ant, which overlaps very much with Formica lugubris. So telling these apart in Scotland is actually, it's often not too bad because Formica lugubris lives up to its common name here. It's very hairy, has lots of hair standing up on its mesosoma. The Scottish wood ant, in comparison, is often, but not always, quite hairless. So there's a lot of overlap in the hairiness between these 2 species, but you can quite often tell them apart. Okay, so if we go back to our Bluffer's guide, then we have now covered the yellow ants here and these large bicolored ants. Now, I said the other two Formicine ants are both black, and so they're rather much harder to tell apart. So this is, firstly, one of them's a Lasius. So this is going to be Lasius niger, if it's the most common black ant. So the common black ant, or the garden black ant, very common, very well known to most people. It's very much associated with human interference. So gardens will be a common habitat for it, but not only in gardens. And it's the one that's subject to a lot of news reports when you have flying ant invasions as well, like you're seeing here, these flying ants being released. So that's the black Lasius. And then the black Formica is one of two species, Formica lemani or Formica fusca. And on the face of it, it looks pretty similar to Lasius. So how do you tell them apart from this difference in size, which takes a bit of getting used to? Well, once you get used to them, you see that they actually differ quite a lot in how they move. That takes some experience, but it's something that's worth looking for. So especially when they're foraging, Lasius niger and the black Formica species look quite different. And I hope these videos show this well. As I say, the compression may not allow them to come up very easily. This is Lasius niger. When it forages, it moves around, it kind of stops and starts, but it's always on the go. Even when it stops, it's kind of searching through crevices and things, as I hope you can see there. And there's another view of a Lasius niger foraging around. In comparison, this is Formica lemani, and you can see that it kind of stops and starts. It moves a bit, and it stops and kind of waits and looks, or kind of looks. So it kind of moves along in spurts. Here's another view of a Formica lemani. So even though morphologically they look pretty similar, actually in the field, they actually can be distinguished quite easily. I'm always I always think that these resemble the difference in the way that a starling or a blackbird forages. So the starling would be continually moving along, not really stopping in any one place very long. The blackbird hops along, stops, then hops along and stops. So that's how you could remember how to distinguish Lasius niger and the Formica species. But eventually you're going to want to distinguish these species through the keys and to be sure of how to distinguish them, Lasius and Formica. So one of the most common characters in the keys is to look at the shape of the spiracle on the rear of the mesosoma, so the propodial spiracle. And the key says in Lasius, this is round or oval, and in Formica, it's slit-shaped. It's a very clear character, but it's very hard. It causes a lot of confusion amongst people. And I think the reason for that is that you have to look at the shape of the actual hole, the opening itself, and not the surrounding rim of the spiracle, because the surrounding rim is oval in each case, but it's the hole itself which is either oval or slit-shaped. And so if you look for the hole, then you will find that character is actually okay. But there is a much easier character that you could use for distinguishing Lasius and Formica, and this requires flipping over the ant and looking at the rear coxa. So this is the basal leg segment here. And in Lasius, you'll see that the two base segments of the rear legs, they don't meet in the middle. They have a gap here, a kind of an inverted U-shaped gap, and that's the same shape as the bottom of the waist, the petiole waist here, because that fits into that gap when the gaster is moved underneath the ant, between its legs. In Formica, the coxae actually meet in the middle, and they form this inverted V-shaped gap instead, which is the same shape as the bottom of the petiole in that case. Again, so the gaster fits in and locks into that place, that shape, when the gaster is moved underneath the body when the ant is being aggressive and is ready to squirt acid on prey or enemy. So this character actually is a lot easier to use than the spiracle character, but still you have to get quite close to the ant in order to be able to see this. Okay, so when I've talked about the black Formica species, I've mentioned both lemani and fusca, and these two are geographically quite distinct, one being southeastern and one being northwestern, but as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between them, And so you do have to be careful distinguishing these. Luckily, they're quite easy to tell apart with a lens, even in the field, because the Lemani has these standing hairs on the front part of its mesosoma, which are completely absent from Fusca. So again, you have to be a little bit careful with the lighting, and sometimes these can be rubbed off in an older ant, so you'd have to check several specimens to look at this. But you can generally tend to do this in the field. Okay, so we've now dealt with this subfamily, Formica and Lasius, and the common species there. So now we're looking within the Myrmicinae, this other subfamily, which contains two genera, Myrmica and Leptothorax. So do you remember how we distinguish Myrmicinae from Formicinae? Remember that the Myrmicine ants are wrinkly, they have this two-segmented waist, and they have spines on the end of the mesosoma. So that's the way we distinguish Myrmica and Leptothorax from the other common species. Right, so these are Myrmica, and they're generally known as red ants. And there's a lot of species in the genus. It's a very interesting genus. Some of them are very common and abundant, and these are generally known as common red ants. So they're abundant everywhere. And they live in much smaller colonies than Formica and Lasius, but they can still be quite aggressive individually. In the garden setting, they can be sometimes not so easy to see because they don't compete very well with Lasius niger, so they tend to have to be keep out the way and keep out the way from Lasius. Otherwise, they get the colonies get completely destroyed by Lasius. So within Myrmica, there's a lot of species. The commonest species are Ruginodis, Rubra, Scabrionodis, and Sabuletti. And I'm not going to tell you within the scope of this talk how to distinguish those species completely, but just to point you to how to look at one of the most important characters used in the keys to look at Myrmica species in general. And that is the shape of the first segment of the antenna, which is known as a scape. So this is the antenna, the antennal segments, and the basal segment, the first segment, is this elongated segment called a scape. And the important thing when going through the keys, looking at Myrmica species, is it's best to view the scape from behind. So if you have your ant and you view it from behind, from the head, then you'll be able to see the shape of the scape much more easily. And then what you'll see is that the Myrmica workers segregate into these two groups, really quite straightforwardly. So Myrmica ruginodis and rubra, which are both very common, they're both known as common red ants. They have this long, slender curved scape, so that it has a gentle curve at the base where it joins onto the head. So that's Myrmica ruginodis and rubra. All the other Myrmica species, including these two common species here, Scabrionodis and Sabuletti, have a stouter scape, and it has this abrupt bend at the base here. So for this reason, they're sometimes known colloquially as elbowed red ants, as opposed to common red ants, but they're also just as common as the other two species above. So that is as much as I want to say about how to distinguish those species, just for the sake of keeping this talk to time, really. In the questions, we could go through a bit more about how to distinguish these different species here, if you want to. But eventually, you'll see a lot of Myrmica ants as you start looking for ants, but eventually you'll come across some ants that look a bit different. They look like Myrmica, but they move a bit more differently. And this may be because you've now found the last ant in the Bluffer's Guide, and that is Leptothorax acerborum. So I've called this a slender carpenter ant. A lot of people will not like that name. I've only just made it up just to make this, as I say, more accessible to those who don't get on with the Latin names. So this in the field looks like a small and very timid Myrmica. And I've said it in my Bluffer's key that it's a small bicolored ant. And that's true. You can see here, this is Leptothorax. Compare with Myrmica to the same scale. It's smaller and it does look bicolored with a lighter middle. In the field, though, it's quite hard to see that, and it will quite often look blackish. So I've called it this slender carpenter ant because actually, quintessentially, it will nest in dry, hard, dead wood. Sun-exposed, dry, hard, dead wood, so never in shade, really, just in the sun. And that's important because some Myrmica species will live in very rotten, damp, dead wood in the shade. So Myrmica ruginodis will often do that within woods. So it lives within dead wood, and you may well come across it if you're looking at dead standing trees for wood nesting wasps and bees. So you may come across this little Myrmica just moving around, dashing around on the surface. Myrmica-like insect, but it's actually Leptothorax. But it doesn't just live in hard dead wood. It also live very, very commonly within moorland peat, and also under stones as well. So you can't use whether it's nesting in wood or not as being the way to distinguish it completely. So it's smaller, it's kind of bicolored, but eventually you're going to want to confirm that it's Leptothorax as opposed to a Myrmica. And the keys use a very, very clear character, but it's also a very small character, and that is the number of antennal segments. So for Leptothorax, that is 11 segments. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, including the scape. Whereas Myrmica is 12 segments. That's 12, including the scape we're seeing end on here. So it's a very clear difference, but it's one that's very hard to see even with a strong hand lens. You really need a stereo microscope. But again, as a beginner, actually, what you should be doing is getting used to how this ant looks different in the field. And I would say that the way that the Leptothorax moves and behaves in the field is quite different from a Myrmica. And it's quite hard to explain, but basically it's a very delicate, has a very kind of gliding, graceful movement compared with a kind of more robust Myrmica movement. And again, hopefully this video shows it, but I fear it's going to be a bit too jerky in the recording. But this is Myrmica, sorry, this is Leptothorax under a stone, and hopefully you'll be able to see how that it glides along and it moves and it kind of arcs its body as it's moving across the surface in a way that's really not the same as how a Myrmica moves. So you can see how it kind of snakes its way around a little bit. So it's really quite, once you've seen it, you can't mistake it for anything else. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so that is all I want to say, and that's all I want to give for my introduction to identifying ants. I've clearly made a lot of generalizations and simplifications in order to try and help you get started in identifying ants. But hopefully it gives you the confidence then to go to tackle the keys in more detail. And eventually, if you do that, you'll come across ants that don't fit those common species. But you'll have then hopefully experience to go through the keys and find out what they are. And then hopefully you'll find other really nice goody ants, such as this narrow-headed ant here in Scotland. Here's a nice nest here, or something called the indolent ant.